the illusion of independence. The streets were filled with celebration. Flags waved in the air, drums echoed through the night, and voices rose in unison, chanting freedom, chanting hope, chanting a future that had finally arrived. Across Africa, from Ghana to Nigeria, from Kenya to Congo, the 1900s marked a turning point in history. Colonial rule, which had lasted for decades, was coming to an end. For the first time in generations, Africans stood beneath their own flags. Leaders emerged, speeches were made, and the dream of self-rule, long fought for through resistance, protest, and sacrifice, seemed to have finally become reality. In Ghana, when independence was declared in 1957, Kwame Nkrumah stood before his people and proclaimed that the independence of Ghana was meaningless unless it was linked with the total liberation of Africa. His words echoed across the continent, igniting a wave of nationalism and unity. Soon after country followed. Nigeria gained independence in 1960. Kenya followed in 1963. Across Francophone Africa, nations broke free from France, while others cut ties with the United Kingdom and Belgium. To the world, it looked like the end of the empire. But behind the celebrations, behind the speeches and ceremonies, something far less visible was taking shape. Because while the flags changed, the systems did not. The deals no one saw. Independence did not come as a clean break. Conditions, agreements, signed quietly, often away from the public eye. In many cases, it came with. These agreements ensured that former colonial powers would continue to benefit, even after officially leaving. In several African countries, newly independent governments were required to maintain economic ties that heavily favored their former rulers. Natural resources, oil, minerals, agricultural products, continued to flow outward, often under terms that brought minimal benefit back to the local population. In some cases, currencies remained tied to European systems. In others, military cooperation agreements were signed, allowing foreign powers to retain influence over national security. And perhaps most importantly, the administrative structures left behind were not designed for true independence. They were designed for control. A system built to depend. Colonial governments had not prepared African nations for self-sufficiency. Instead, they had structured economies to serve a single purpose: extraction. Raw materials were exported. Finished goods were imported. This meant that, even after independence, many African countries found themselves unable to function without external support. Industries were underdeveloped, infrastructure was limited, and the skills required to manage complex economies had often been withheld during colonial rule. So when independence came, it came with a hidden burden: dependence. New governments inherited systems they did not fully control, economies they could not easily transform, and international relationships that were already unequal. Freedom had been declared, but autonomy was still out of reach. Leadership under pressure. The leaders who emerged during this period faced enormous challenges. They were expected to unite diverse populations, build functioning states, and deliver rapid development, all while navigating the lingering influence of foreign powers. Some tried to break free completely. Figures like Kwame Nkrumah pushed for economic independence and Pan-African unity. Others, like Patrice Lumumba, sought to assert full control over their nation's resources. But these efforts often came at a cost. Because challenging the existing system meant confronting powerful global interests, and those interests were not willing to let go easily. The Congo crisis, a warning to the continent. Nowhere was this struggle more visible than in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. When the Congo gained independence from Belgium in 1960, it was one of the richest territories in Africa, abundant in minerals like copper, uranium, and diamonds. But within weeks, the country descended into chaos. The army mutinied. Regions attempted to break away. Foreign interests moved quickly to secure control over key resources. At the center of it all was Patrice Lumumba, a leader determined to keep the Congo united and independent. But his vision threatened powerful forces. Within months, Lumumba was removed from power. Shortly after, he was assassinated. His death sent a clear message, not just to the Congo, but to the entire continent. True independence would not be easily tolerated. Freedom with limits. By the late 1900s, most of Africa had achieved formal independence. Flags had changed. Governments were African-led. National anthems replaced colonial symbols. But beneath the surface, many of the old dynamics remained. Economic systems still favored external powers. Political structures were fragile, and international influence continued to shape decisions at the highest levels. It was a new era, but not a completely new reality, because control had not disappeared. It had simply adapted. The beginning of a new kind of control. This was the foundation of what many would later call modern influence. A system where direct rule was no longer necessary because indirect control could achieve the same results. No longer enforced through colonial governors and armies, but through agreements, institutions, and economic pressure. A system where nations appeared independent, but remained deeply connected to external powers in ways that limited their freedom. And for many Africans, the question began to emerge. Was this true independence, or just a different form of control? This was only the beginning of the story, because if independence was the illusion, then the real question is this: what replaced colonial rule, and who truly holds power today? Independence had come, but freedom came with a price. In the years following independence across Africa in the 1900s, many newly formed governments faced a harsh reality. Their nations were politically free, but economically fragile. Infrastructure was weak, industries were underdeveloped, and government revenues were too small to support rapid development. Leaders needed to build roads, schools, hospitals, and entire economies from the ground up. And for that, they needed money. This is where global financial institutions stepped in. Organizations like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank presented themselves as partners in development. They offered loans to African countries, promising economic growth, modernization, and development and stability. At first, this seemed like a solution. But over time, these loans became something else entirely. They became a trap. Many African countries borrowed heavily during the 1970s and 1980s. Governments believed that with enough funding, they could industrialize quickly and catch up with the developed world. But global conditions changed. Commodity prices dropped. Oil prices fluctuated. Export earnings fell. And suddenly, many African nations found themselves unable to repay their debts. What followed was a new form of control, one that did not rely on armies or colonial rule. Instead, it relied on conditions. To receive new loans or restructure existing debt, countries were required to implement strict economic policies known as structural adjustment programs. These programs demanded deep changes. Governments were told to cut public spending. Subsidies on food, fuel, and basic services were removed. State-owned companies were privatized. Trade barriers were lowered. allowing foreign goods to flood local markets. On paper, these reforms were meant to stabilize economies. In reality, they often had devastating effects. Healthcare systems weakened as funding was reduced. Education suffered as schools struggled to operate. Millions of people faced rising costs of living while wages remained low. Local industries, which were still developing, could not compete with cheaper foreign imports. Many collapsed. And as economies struggled, countries needed even more loans. The cycle continued. Debt led to more borrowing. Borrowing led to more conditions. And those conditions often deepened the very problems they were meant to solve. This is what many critics describe as a debt trap. A system where nations are never truly able to break free because the cost of repayment keeps them dependent on external support. In some cases, a significant portion of national revenue goes toward servicing debt, paying back loans instead of investing in development. This means that even decades after independence, many African countries still prioritize external financial obligations over internal growth. And with that comes influence. Because when a nation depends on external funding, those who provide that funding gain power. They can influence economic policies. They can shape national priorities. They can determine what a country can or cannot do. This influence is not always visible. There are no colonial flags, no foreign rulers. But the impact is real. Decisions made in distant financial institutions can affect the daily lives of millions of people across Africa. Some leaders have tried to resist this system. There have been calls for debt cancellation, fair trade agreements, and alternative economic models. Some countries have sought new partnerships outside traditional Western institutions. But the system is deeply entrenched. Breaking free is not simple because the global financial system is interconnected. And stepping outside it can bring new risks, economic isolation, reduced investment, and political pressure. Still, the conversation is changing. Across Africa, there is growing awareness of how debt shapes national development. Economists, activists, and policymakers are questioning whether the current system truly serves the continent's interests. They are asking whether development should come with conditions that limit sovereignty. They are asking whether financial assistance should empower nations or control them. And most importantly, they are asking whether Africa can build a future that is not defined by dependence. Because the debt trap is not just about money, it is about power. It is about who makes decisions, who sets the rules, and who ultimately controls the direction of a nation. And as Africa continues to navigate its path in the modern world, one thing becomes clear. The end of colonial rule did not mean the end of control. It simply marked the beginning of a new system, one that operates through economics instead of empire, a system that is harder to see, but just as powerful. Now the question is no longer whether Africa is independent. The question is, at what cost? Who owns Africa's resources? Africa is one of the richest continents on Earth. Beneath its soil lies immense wealth: gold, diamonds, oil, cobalt, coltan, uranium, and countless other natural resources that power the modern world. From the smartphones in our hands to the cars we drive and the energy that fuels global industries, many of the raw materials originate from Africa. And yet, despite this abundance, many African nations remain economically challenged. How is that possible? The answer lies in a critical question. Who truly owns and controls these resources? During the colonial era, Africa's natural wealth was extracted for the benefit of European powers. Minerals were mined, crops were harvested, and everything was exported to fuel industries overseas. When independence came in the 1900s, Many believed the system would end, but in reality, it evolved. Instead of direct control by colonial governments, foreign corporations stepped in. Large multinational companies began securing contracts to extract resources across the continent. These agreements were often signed under pressure during periods of political instability or at times when African governments had limited negotiating power. In many cases, the terms favored the corporations. They gained long-term access to valuable resources, sometimes for decades, while the host countries received only a small share of the profits. Take the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for example. It is one of the richest countries in the world in terms of natural resources, especially cobalt, a critical component used in batteries for smartphones, laptops, and electric vehicles. Global demand for cobalt has skyrocketed. Yet despite this, the Congo remains one of the poorest nations on Earth. Much of its mining sector is controlled by foreign companies. Raw materials are exported, processed elsewhere, and sold at significantly higher value on the global market. The country that owns the resource often benefits the least. A similar pattern can be seen in oil-producing nations like Nigeria. Nigeria is one of Africa's largest oil producers, yet many of its citizens live without reliable electricity or basic infrastructure. Why? Because a significant portion of oil operations is managed by multinational corporations. While governments do earn revenue, issues like profit-sharing agreements, corruption, and environmental damage limit the impact on everyday citizens. In regions like the Niger Delta, communities have faced pollution, loss of livelihoods, and environmental destruction, while the wealth generated from their land flows elsewhere. Gold tells a similar story. Countries like Ghana and South Africa have long histories of gold mining. Yet much of the refining and value addition takes place outside Africa. This means that instead of exporting finished high-value products, many African countries export raw materials at lower prices. The real profits are made elsewhere. This system is often referred to as unequal exchange. Africa supplies the raw materials. The rest of the world processes them, manufactures finished goods, and sells them back at a much higher price. The result is a cycle where Africa remains a supplier rather than a manufacturer. And that cycle limits economic growth. Because true wealth is not just in owning resources, it is in controlling the entire value chain, from extraction to processing to manufacturing and distribution. But control over resources is not just economic. It is also political. In some cases, foreign interests have influenced internal conflicts to maintain access to valuable materials. Armed groups, illegal mining operations, and smuggling networks have emerged around resource-rich areas, particularly in parts of Central Africa. These conflicts are often complex, involving local actors, regional dynamics, and global demand. But one thing is clear. Resources that should bring prosperity have, in some cases, brought instability instead. This is sometimes called the resource curse, a paradox where countries rich in natural resources experience less economic growth and more conflict than those with the fewer resources. Because instead of being a blessing, resources become a source of competition, exploitation, and external interference. Still, the situation is not without hope. Across Africa, there is a growing push for change. Governments are renegotiating contracts. Some are demanding higher royalties and better terms from foreign companies. Others are investing in local industries to process resources within their own borders. There is also a rising movement among young Africans calling for transparency, accountability, and fair distribution of wealth. Technology is playing a role too. With better access to information, citizens are more aware of how resources are managed and more willing to demand change. The goal is simple, but powerful: to ensure that Africa's resources benefit Africa. Not just in theory, but in reality. Because ownership is not just about what lies beneath the ground. It is about who controls it, who profits from it, and who decides how it is used. And until those questions are answered, the story of Africa's wealth will remain incomplete. So once again, the deeper question emerges. If Africa is rich in resources, why are its people not equally rich? Political influence and puppet leadership. Africa's independence in the 1900s brought a sense of pride and optimism. New leaders emerged. Citizens voted in their first elections, and the continent seemed poised to chart its own destiny. But beneath the surface, a new form of influence was quietly taking shape, one that would determine who held power, how they exercised it, and ultimately, how independent their nations truly were. Political influence did not vanish with the colonial rule. It simply adapted. Instead of governors and colonial officials, foreign powers began to operate through political advisors, diplomats, and economic leverage. They sought to shape outcomes without overt control. In many ways, the system of influence became more sophisticated, subtle, and difficult to detect. One of the primary ways this influence manifested was through the backing of certain leaders. During the early years of independence, foreign powers often supported candidates or factions that aligned with their strategic, economic, or political interests. Leaders who promised stability, access to resources, or alignment with global economic policies were favored. Those who challenged external influence faced immense pressure. Take the Democratic Republic of the Congo, for example. Patrice Lumumba, a charismatic leader determined to control his country's vast resources, quickly became a target. His insistence on independence from foreign interference made him a threat to powerful interests abroad. Within months of independence, Lumumba was removed from power and ultimately assassinated, sending a chilling message to leaders across the continent. Defy external powers and you risk everything. Similarly, in many West African nations, early governments were subtly pressured to adopt policies that served foreign economic agendas. Elections were sometimes influenced through funding, political advice, or even covert operations designed to ensure favorable outcomes. The goal was not to govern directly, but to ensure that leadership aligned with external objectives. This system also relied on creating divisions within countries. Foreign powers often exploited ethnic, regional, or political tensions to weaken opposition. By supporting certain groups and marginalizing others, they could ensure that governments remained dependent on their guidance and resources. These strategies were subtle yet effective, shaping political outcomes for decades to come. The consequences were profound. Leaders who sought to challenge these arrangements were often isolated, undermined, or removed. Those who cooperated enjoyed support, resources, and recognition from powerful international allies. In some cases, foreign support allowed leaders to consolidate power, creating systems that were democratic in name but authoritarian in practice. This dynamic has persisted into the modern era. Even today, foreign influence is evident in election monitoring, development aid conditionality, and the strategic support of favored politicians. International organizations, multinational corporations, and foreign governments all play a role in shaping the political landscape, sometimes overtly, sometimes behind the scenes. One of the most striking aspects of this influence is its invisibility. Citizens often believe their governments are fully autonomous, unaware of the subtle pressures and external interests guiding decisions at the highest levels. Policies, trade agreements, and even constitutional amendments may be shaped by forces beyond the nation's borders. Yet, despite these challenges, African leaders and citizens have not been passive. Many have worked tirelessly to assert autonomy, resist undue influence, and prioritize national interests. Pan-African movements, regional alliances, and grassroots activism have all sought to counterbalance external control. The struggle for political independence is ongoing. It is no longer solely about removing colonial rule. It is about reclaiming authority over one's own country in a world where economic, diplomatic, and strategic pressures can shape outcomes just as effectively as armies once did. Political influence and puppet leadership remain a central theme in understanding Africa's post-independence history. The leaders who were supported, the policies that were encouraged, and the opposition that was suppressed all paint a picture of a continent struggling to break free from the shackles of colonial rule. Of a continent navigating freedom while grappling with new forms of external control. The lesson is clear. Political independence does not automatically equate to true sovereignty. Leadership is only as independent as the system allows. And in Africa, the systems inherited from the past, combined with global pressures, have often limited the ability of nations to act fully in their own interest. The fight for true autonomy, both politically and economically, continues. And understanding the subtle ways in which influence is exerted is key to recognizing the challenges Africa still faces today. Military presence and control. In the 1900s, Africa's independence seemed complete. Flags were raised, constitutions were signed, and national anthems replaced colonial hymns. Yet, behind the celebrations and promises of self-rule, a new form of influence was quietly solidifying, one that relied not on colonial governors or imperial armies, but on the continued presence of foreign military power and strategic control. Military influence became a cornerstone of external control. Unlike direct colonial occupation, this form of oversight operated through partnerships, bases, and agreements that appeared mutually beneficial but often served foreign interests first. These arrangements allowed global powers to maintain strategic access to key regions, resources, and political leverage, all under the guise of cooperation or security assistance. One of the most visible examples of this influence was the establishment of foreign military bases across Africa. Nations such as Djibouti host multiple foreign forces, including troops from France, United States, and China. Ostensibly, these deployments were meant to combat piracy, terrorism, and regional instability. In reality, they ensured that external powers had a permanent strategic foothold on the continent. Armed assistance also played a key role in shaping domestic politics. Foreign nations frequently provided training, equipment, and funding to certain military factions within African countries. While framed as support for national security, these resources often reinforced leaders who aligned with external interests and weakened those who resisted. In some cases, this influence directly determined the outcome of internal conflicts and even leadership succession. The Cold War era amplified these dynamics. Africa became a strategic chessboard for the United States and the Soviet Union, each seeking allies and influence. Proxy wars erupted in Angola, Mozambique, and Ethiopia, leaving millions dead and societies destabilized. While these conflicts were portrayed as ideological battles, access to resources and geopolitical positioning were equally, if not more, important. Foreign powers funneled weapons, advisors, and intelligence support to governments and rebel groups alike, ensuring their favored parties remained dominant. Even after the Cold War, military influence did not vanish. Modern security arrangements, counterterrorism operations, and regional interventions continue to embed foreign forces in African affairs. While such efforts are often justified as stabilizing interventions, they frequently serve dual purposes, maintaining global influence while securing access to vital resources or strategic locations. A critical aspect of this military control is its subtlety. Unlike overt colonization, the presence of foreign troops is often framed as partnership, collaboration, or humanitarian support. This makes it less visible to the public, but no less influential. Policies, decisions, and even elections can be swayed indirectly through military support, training, or the strategic positioning of forces. Resource protection is another major factor. Foreign militaries are often stationed near areas rich in minerals, oil, or other valuable commodities. This ensures that extraction and transport remain secure, benefiting multinational corporations and foreign governments. African nations, while nominally sovereign, often have limited authority over the movement and deployment of these forces, further constraining their autonomy. The impact on local populations can be profound. Military interventions, both overt and covert, have contributed to prolonged conflicts, displacement, and social unrest. Communities near strategic locations often face increased surveillance, restrictions, or disruptions, while decisions about their own security are influenced by powers beyond their borders. Despite these challenges, many African nations have sought to assert control over their security apparatuses. Regional organizations like the African Union and sub-regional groups, such as ECOWAS, have developed frameworks for peacekeeping, conflict resolution, and military coordination. Some countries have also pursued partnerships outside traditional Western powers, seeking diversified support from nations like China, Russia, and Turkey. However, the balance of power remains skewed. The legacy of foreign military influence continues to shape national priorities, defense policies, and strategic decisions. Leaders must constantly navigate the delicate tension between sovereignty and dependence, between national interest and international expectation. It is not inherently negative. It can provide stability, training, and military presence support. But when embedded within a broader system of external influence, it becomes a tool of control. This system demonstrates that independence, while celebrated with flags and ceremonies, is often constrained by forces that operate quietly, yet effectively behind the scenes. The pattern is clear. From formal colonization to political influence and economic pressure, military presence represents the next layer of modern control. It is a reminder that sovereignty is not simply a matter of law or declaration. It is a matter of real-world capacity and freedom to act without external interference. As Africa continues to navigate its complex security landscape, the question remains, can true autonomy coexist with entrenched foreign military influence, or will control persist under a new guise? Media, culture, and economic dependency. Independence in the 1900s promised political freedom, but true autonomy involves more than flags, constitutions, or elections. It extends into culture, media, and economics, the spheres that shape daily life, influence thinking, and determine who holds power. Over decades, these channels became critical tools in maintaining control over African nations, often in ways that were invisible but highly effective. Media was one of the first instruments. After independence, many African countries relied heavily on foreign-owned or foreign-funded media outlets for news, education, and entertainment. Television networks, newspapers, and radio stations were often established with international support. While these platforms provided vital information, they also carried perspectives and narratives shaped by external interests. Stories about Africa were framed through lenses that emphasized dependency, instability, or failure, subtly influencing public perception and international opinion. Cultural influence was equally significant. Globalization and media exports from Europe, North America, and Asia introduced foreign music, fashion, movies, and lifestyle standards across Africa. While cultural exchange can be positive, this constant influx of foreign narratives sometimes overshadows local traditions, history, and identity. Young Africans grew up consuming media that glorified foreign lifestyles while underrepresenting their own heritage, creating a subtle psychological influence that shaped values and aspirations. Economic dependency reinforced this influence. Many African economies remained structured around the export of raw materials and the import of finished goods, a system inherited from the colonial era. Foreign companies dominated sectors like mining, agriculture, telecommunications, and banking. Even development programs, international aid, and investment projects often came with strings attached. Conditions tied to loans, grants, or technical support dictated economic policies, budget priorities, and trade agreements. These measures limited the ability of African nations to fully define and pursue independent economic strategies. Advertising and media campaigns also played a role in shaping consumer habits and expectations. International brands promoted lifestyles that created demand for imported goods, often at the expense of local industries. This economic influence intertwined with cultural messaging, reinforcing dependence on external products, expertise, and standards. Politically, media and economic influence were interconnected. Leaders who aligned with foreign interests often received positive coverage, international recognition, and financial support. Those who challenged these arrangements risked negative portrayal, sanctions, or withdrawal of support. As a result, governments learned to navigate public perception, sometimes prioritizing external approval over domestic needs. Education was another vector of influence. Textbooks, curricula, and academic resources were often supplied by foreign publishers or designed according to international standards. While this provided valuable knowledge, it also subtly framed African history, economics, and politics through external perspectives. For decades, generations of Africans were educated that emphasized dependency and that underdevelopment rather than self-determination. In ways, reinforced narratives. The cumulative effect of media, culture, and economic influence created a system where independence was constrained by perception, values, and financial realities. Even with formal sovereignty, African nations faced limits on how they could shape their societies, economies, and identities. Yet resistance persisted. Local media emerged to tell authentic stories. African filmmakers, musicians, writers, and journalists worked to reclaim narratives and highlight indigenous culture. Economically, some countries pursued regional integration, diversified trade partnerships, and policies to encourage local production. Social movements demanded transparency, accountability, and prioritization of local needs over external agendas. The interplay of media, culture, and economic structures demonstrates that influence is multidimensional. Political independence alone does not guarantee full autonomy. Control can operate through the very systems that shape thought, aspiration, and opportunity. Understanding these subtle mechanisms is essential to grasp the modern landscape of African governance, development, and identity. It reveals how deeply interwoven foreign influence can be, and how challenging it is to achieve self-determination in a globalized world. As the continent moves forward, the lessons are clear. Reclaiming independence requires more than political change. It demands economic empowerment, cultural affirmation, and control over the narratives that define Africa's past, present, and future. Africa rising, breaking free. For decades, Africa's story has been one of struggle against colonial rule, debt, foreign control, and economic dependency. Yet the continent's journey is not only one of oppression, it is also a story of resilience, ingenuity, and determination. Today, Africa is rising, seeking to reclaim control over its politics, resources, culture, and economy. The first signs of this resurgence can be seen in the growing assertion of political autonomy. Across the continent, leaders and citizens alike are questioning the influence of external powers and challenging policies that prioritize one foreign interests over local needs. Regional organizations such as the African Union, ECOWAS, and ESEG have strengthened frameworks for collective security, trade, and governance, reducing the leverage of outside actors. These bodies serve as platforms for African nations to collaborate, negotiate, and assert common interests on the global stage. Economically, Africa is making strides to break the cycle of dependency. Countries are diversifying trade partners, investing in industrialization, and developing local manufacturing capabilities. Initiatives like the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, aim to increase intra-African trade, reduce reliance on exports to traditional Western markets, and foster economic self-reliance. By keeping value chains within the continent, Africa can maximize the benefits of its abundant natural resources and ensure that wealth generated from these assets benefits local populations. Young Africans are playing a pivotal role in this renaissance. They are leveraging technology, social media, and entrepreneurship to challenge entrenched systems and create innovative solutions to long-standing problems. From fintech startups to tech hubs, education platforms, and social campaigns, Africa's youth are redefining what it means to be empowered, connected, and in control of their own future. Cultural resurgence is also underway. African artists, filmmakers, musicians, and writers are reclaiming the narrative of the continent. By telling authentic stories, celebrating heritage, and challenging stereotypes, we are reshaping the narrative of Africa. They are asserting Africa's identity on the global stage. This cultural revival reinforces pride, inspires unity, and strengthens resistance against the subtle psychological influence of external narratives. Debt and economic leverage remain challenges, but African nations are increasingly negotiating from positions of strength. Countries like Nigeria, South Africa, and Kenya are demanding better terms from international lenders, exploring alternative financing options, and prioritizing strategic domestic investments. These efforts signal a shift from passive acceptance to active management of external relationships. At the same time, grassroots movements across Africa are holding governments accountable, advocating for transparency, and pushing for policies that prioritize citizens over foreign interests. Civil society, advocacy groups, and independent media are critical in ensuring that the continent's rise is inclusive and sustainable. The continent's from complete. Challenges remain in governance, infrastructure, education, health, and equitable distribution of resources. External pressures continue to exist, and the legacy of past exploitation is deeply ingrained. But the momentum is undeniable. Africa is asserting its agency, reclaiming its resources, and defining its own path forward. Journey is a very good person. Far. This resurgence is not only about economic or political power, it is about dignity, identity, and the right to shape Africa's destiny without interference. It is a declaration that independence is more than a historical milestone. It is a continuous struggle, a collective effort, and an enduring aspiration. Africa's rise is multifaceted. It is seen in economic innovation, political autonomy, cultural revival, and social empowerment. It is driven by a generation unwilling to accept the limitations of the past and determined to create a future defined by self-determination. The story of Africa is still being written. While the continent has faced centuries of exploitation and control, the narrative is shifting. Africa is moving from being a continent shaped by external powers to one that shapes its own destiny. The question that remains is no longer whether Africa can rise, it is whether the world will allow the continent to do so on its own terms. True independence is not a single event. It is a process, a commitment, and a vision. Africa's rise is proof that even after decades of challenges, resilience, creativity, and unity can pave the way for a future that is truly African. Africa is breaking free not in one moment, but through continuous effort, determination, and the courage to reclaim what was always rightfully theirs. The continent's story, while shaped by struggle, is ultimately defined by its relentless pursuit of freedom, justice, and self-determination. The journey continues, and Africa is rising. Don't forget to subscribe to Untold Reality Daily for more exciting stories.